Houston.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Robbie Madrigal. I'm one of the organizers of today's program. The title of today's program is "What is Accountability? A History of Philadelphia's Police Advisory Board" with Dr. Aaron Bekemeyer from Harvard University. He will explore the rise and fall of Philadelphia's Civilian Advisory Board over its decade-long existence, showing how it became a flashpoint in larger debates about policing and helped launch the local police union to greater prominence, and reflecting on what its story says about the nature of democratic control of the police. I'll now read the land acknowledgement before turning the program over to Dr. Teixeira. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous people. And I just want to say that this is the second time Dr. Bekemeyer has joined us, and we're grateful that he's decided to join us again. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Mary Teixeira.
Thank you, Robbie. Hi, everyone. I am Mary Teixeira, and I just retired from professorship at Cal State in the sociology department. But you can't get rid of me, I guess. I keep popping up, so here I am again today, and very, very happy to introduce our guest, who is Dr. Aaron Bekemeyer. He's a historian of politics, citizenship, labor, and the state in 20th century U.S. history. His current project, The Labor of Law and Order: How Police Unions Transformed Policing and Politics in the United States, 1939 to 1985, analyzes the emergence of rank-and-file police officers as independent political subjects in the second half of the 20th century. It explores officers' experiences of police work as the foundation of workplace and political organizing that not only remade police administration and practice, but also ushered in a new American political order rooted in law and order politics and tough on crime policing. And these are topics that we have discussed in the last 2 years and some change, and we are very, very happy to continue that conversation with Dr. Bekemeyer today. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Bekemeyer.
Thank you, Mary and Robbie, and thanks all of you for organizing these events and for welcoming me here today. I'm really excited to be joining you all here again. So let me just pull up my screen here, and we can get right into it. So the talk that I'm going to give today is about this idea of accountability that people raise in the question of how police departments should be run, the politics of policing, and so forth, and the ways that people sort of talk about a lack of accountability of the police to somebody, right, as one of the roots of the harms that come from policing. And so what I want to do today is kind of get into some of these ideas by way of a historical example of a civilian sort of police review board that was set up in Philadelphia in the 1950s, the first such entity in the history of the United States, and to see what we can learn from the story of the rise and fall of this board about how to think about this idea of accountability and what kind of relevance it has for the politics of policing today. So just to give you a sense of where I want to go with this, I want to start out just by sort of discussing why I've chosen this particular framing in the first place, and also why Philadelphia is a useful place to sort of look at to help understand these kinds of questions. And then in the bulk of what I have to say, I will talk a little bit about the board that the city set up, came to be known as the Police Advisory Board, how it worked, what it did, how people felt about it, what kind of challenges it faced, And after that, I will talk about some alternatives, right? If folks understood a lack of accountability as a problem at the time, what kinds of alternatives to this civilian review board were people thinking about or trying to implement at the time? And then just wrap up by trying to connect things up to the present moment. Excuse me, the present moment, just a little bit. And hopefully I will not speak so long that I want there to be plenty of time for questions if people have them. So, all right. So first, why am I framing this around the idea of accountability? I think just to be, very explicit about it, one of the theories that tries to account for the harms that we associate with policing, many harms, right, in the form of brutality, in the form of discrimination, in the forms of other abuses of authority and so forth that come from police. One idea is that the absence of accountability of police officers to somebody else, right, is the root of these harms. And there's many versions of this argument, but just to sum up, I think a common one, the idea is that because police operate without meaningful public oversight or discipline, right, without a mechanism for making sure that they operate according to some normative idea of what police should be and should do, officers are free, so should they so choose or be so motivated, to inflict harm without limit or consequence, right? This distilled out is the idea. And this is an idea that we hear about either explicitly or implicitly in contemporary debates about policing, but it's not new. It goes back quite a ways in the history of policing and police reform. And it was the basis for implementing the Civilian Review Board in Philadelphia that we see cropping up in the late 1950s that I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. The other question sort of here is, why focus on Philadelphia? Why was this a place where the first sort of city civilian review board came to exist in the first place? And why is this a useful place to sort of think through the question of civilian review as a form of great increasing accountability over police officers? Well, part of the reason that it sort of came to be in the first place is that there was a robust ecosystem in Philadelphia of civil rights organizations that had sort of been growing in the prior decades, all of whom sort of helped contribute to the emergence of the Civilian Review Board. And by this, I mean, in part, interfaith groups like the Fellowship Commission, which was a sort of a coalition of many individual, ecumenical, and typically often sort of Christian or Jewish groups in the city, many of which had either come to be or grown in efforts to kind of combat fascism and far-right politics in the city in the 1930s and 1940s. So already this kind of organizational infrastructure is present in Philadelphia. There are also other groups that are more national in scale. The Philadelphia chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union was instrumental in bringing about this board. And the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, also played a role in bringing the board into being and helping it function as well. So that's part of the reason we even see this phenomenon existing in the first place. And the board sort of is established in 1958 in response to various sort of forms of police abuse. So police brutality, violence inflicted by police on the residents of Philadelphia. A lot of the motivation, a lot of the sort of complaints that came to the city about police abuses were about vice policing in the city, policing that was designed to sort of regulate or crack down on illegal drinking establishments, gambling establishments, on sex work, on things like this. But this would take the form often of, say, warrantless raids in people's homes and businesses. And a number of other things as well that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. So there were people had grievances, but there wasn't a mechanism formally for people to actually sort of bring a grievance to the city or the police department. At best, the part of the police department that handled internal reviews might receive complaints like this, but it wasn't really set up to do that, and nobody was really trying to sort of make it do that. And so the groups like the FC, the ACLU, and the NAACP, and politicians like Richardson Dilworth, who was the mayor here you see of Philadelphia for 4 years from the late I got the date a little bit wrong there actually, from the late 1950s to the early 1960s. are instrumental in setting this up. Actually, the ACLU tries to get this passed by the city council, the creation of such a board, and that the votes are not there to do it. So instead, it ends up taking the form of a board that's established by the mayor by executive order in late 1958. Okay, so what am I talking about? What is this sort of civilian review board? So this was a board set up by the mayor, full of appointees, by the mayor. It had a staff that fluctuated between 5 and 9 people, plus an executive secretary, that could receive a fairly broad swath of civilian complaints about their interactions with the police. So people could bring complaints about brutality, complaints about sort of illegal or unconstitutional arrest, search, seizure, things like this. They could bring complaints about discrimination according to race, religion, national origin, and always there was kind of a miscellaneous category of complaints that people could bring to in the design of the board and in terms of the kind of complaints that they actually handled. So the scope of responsibility of the kind of complaints that people could bring to the board was fairly broad. And this was one of the questions in the design of the board about, how broad would the mandate of the board be? In practice, fairly broad. It was staffed typically by professionals and academics, sociologists, criminologists, clergy, sometimes local business or labor leaders. These are the kinds of people that the mayor, Mayor Dilworth and his successor would appoint to the board. It was by mayoral appointment. It was typically people coming from this kind of social or professional background. This was not a board that was sort of directly elected by members of the city or anything like that. Another thing to note is that the board has sort of advisory power only. And so what happens when somebody brought a complaint to the board is they would conduct an investigation, and they would, as much as possible, interview police officers involved, the person bringing the complaint, anybody else who seemed like they were part of the interaction. But they didn't have subpoena power, so they couldn't compel testimony or documents or so forth from the police department or from anybody for that matter. They could request investigatory assistance from the police chief in order to gather more information or ask somebody to appear before the board to give testimony, but they could not compel it. They sort of relied on the discretion of the department and of the mayor in order to actually even gather information in the first place. And the mayor, and in fact, even the police chief at the time, a man named Thomas Gibbons, initially were willing to sort of cooperate with that. They actually saw some value in the advisory board, but it still required the cooperation of these other aspects of city government. And when it came to actually sort of drawing a conclusion after investigating a given complaint, the board would present, the facts as they understood them. They would identify if they thought some kind of law or procedure or right had been violated or not, and they would make a recommendation as to what should be done. As you can see, kind of on the right here, there are about 932 complaints that the board processes over an 11-year existence. It's established, as I said, in 1968, and it gets shut down in 1969. So that's under 100 on average per year, though the actual numbers kind of fluctuate over time. In response to those complaints, there were only 30 cases where they recommended that the police department officially reprimand the officer or officers involved, and there were only 20 where they recommended that an officer be suspended. They didn't ever recommend that an officer be fired or anything sort of more serious than suspension. And other kinds of actions that they might take would include requesting an apology from an officer to the person involved. Sometimes they would, set up another conversation between an officer and a complainant. But sometimes that was on the basis of what the person filing the complaint wanted. Sometimes that was at the discretion of the board members themselves. But as you can see, in a city of millions of people, they're processing the number of complaints that are reaching them, which is not to say that the number of complaints that there are is quite low, right? Less than 100 per year. And the kinds of actions they're recommending are relatively kind of light and restrained. And even when they recommended something, it wasn't up to them whether it was implemented. It was, if they recommended a reprimand or a suspension or so forth, it was up to the commissioner to accept or not accept that suggestion and act on it. So this is what I mean when I say there's kind of had advisory power only. The other thing I think is worth emphasizing is that The people who sort of operated the board saw the board as a kind of safety valve. This is the terminology they used. So they saw it as an instrument that kind of mediated the relationship between residents of Philadelphia and police officers, and that also kind of disciplined both of those groups of people in the sense that they saw themselves as kind of educating and nudging both groups involved towards what they understood the proper relationship between police and citizens to be. And so they hoped that when there was some kind of grievance about policing, if somebody believed that their home had been searched illegally, or if somebody had been assaulted by the police or things like this, that this would be a constructive way of repairing that relationship between both parties, as they didn't want to take other forms, that they considered to be more dangerous or less constructive. But they really saw themselves as kind of educators as much as anything else. And I think that in part reflects the composition of who was on this board, right? That these were often professionals or academics who studied or related in some way to law enforcement. They had ideas about what policing should be in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, and they saw it as their role to kind of instill those ideas in both city residents in general and in the police themselves. All right, so what kind of complaints were brought to the board? I've talked about the number, but it's worth discussing the kinds of things that people brought to the board to discuss. Very common complaint, and this I kind of alluded to before, is that officers would regularly stop cars with no pretext, invade homes without warrants, break down doors, grapple with residents to make arrests, things like this. And a lot of these sort of searches and invasions were planned as raids on entities they believe to be illegal businesses in alcohol, drugs, gambling, or sex work. The way that they actually enforced this, typically, officers were much more likely to arrest Black employees of these businesses rather than white Philadelphians who typically owned and managed them, because there was this kind of racialized structure between kind of workers and managers that was very common in these businesses. And many arrests just sort of heedlessly and needlessly disrupted the homes and businesses of Black city residents who were not at all involved in these vice enterprises, but were believed mistakenly or suspected or assumed to be. So a lot of it has to do with that vice policing. One example of this is there was a man, a Black Philadelphian, who described an incident where there was a party going on in his home, and an officer, plainclothes officer, shows up to the party, does not announce himself as an officer. He sort of bursts into the man's basement, starts shouting racial epithets at the people in the party. The man's sister sort of starts, trying to get the officer to leave, gets involved in kind of a tussle, and the man goes to separate the officer and his sister. And he gets arrested as a result of that. And he's one of the people who sort of brings a complaint to the board. And in this case, the board ultimately suggests that he was in the right, that he did not actually do anything blameworthy. That's just the judgment of the board for context. There were other kinds of cases that involved officers kind of snap visual judgments about people around them. So if they thought somebody was intoxicated, publicly intoxicated, and needed to be arrested for that, this was a big chunk of cases. One man once was returning from a doctor's appointment to work in the Navy Yard in Philadelphia. When officers arrested him, they thought he was high. His drug test came back negative. They just weren't even right about that. In another case, there is a Black pastor and block captain in his neighborhood who is arrested as part of a raid in an after-hours bar because they thought that he was drunk. He was taking medication that affected his demeanor, but he wasn't drunk. So this is not actually to kind of get into the merits of whether these arrests should or should not have taken place, but to give you a sense of the kinds of things that people brought to the board when they were making a complaint. Racial scapegoating rampant. There's many cases of officers insulting and arresting just random Black men very often if they're searching for car thieves, drug dealers, vice operatives, and so forth. And so this is just to give you a sense of some breadth of the kinds of cases that people brought to the board. People could bring cases to the board voluntarily, but also people might have approached the ACLU or the NAACP to discuss a case, and those organizations could also suggest that people bring those complaints to the police advisory board, and sometimes represented them legally in those complaints as well. So this hopefully just gives you a sense of what this board was, how it worked, the kinds of things that it dealt with. As I mentioned, the mayor who instantiates it supports the board. The police commissioner is actually pretty supportive of the board at the time. The groups that hope to bring it about supported it, but it also very quickly meets opposition from the local police union. This is Fraternal Order of Police Lodge number 5. The FOP was a national organization of police officers that was sort of a hybrid police union, fraternal organization, social organization. It didn't start out as a union per se, but by the 1950s and 60s, FOP locals are increasingly taking on the role of being the collective bargaining agent of police officers in cities in negotiations with their departments. And so that certainly was true for a long time in Philadelphia as well. And FOP Lodge 5 is a police union there. And from the beginning, they're opposed to the board, and they fight it. I mean, one of the things that happens is almost invariably an FOP funded attorney represents officers who are called to testify before the board. So that's one of the ways the FOP is involved. But they also tried to bring it to an end. So there's 2 lawsuits that the FOP brings against the board. There's one in 1959 that's settled, and then a second one that's filed in 1965. In both cases, the goal is to get a judge to find that the board is not compatible with the city's charter, that it takes away some of the authority of the commissioner to oversee and discipline officers that the charter reserves for the police commissioner. That's the core of the argument that they're making. So they file these lawsuits. But at the same time, they run a PR campaign, make many media appearances, testify before local government, state government, and so forth, sort of suggesting that the board needs to go. They lobby politicians to get rid of the board, and they also do some political education. They generate materials that they want to share with members of the FOP, not only in Philadelphia, but actually around the country, explaining why they think review boards are bad and how to stop one from cropping up in other cities as well. This is like I said, the board in Philadelphia is the first of these in the nation that's put in place, but there are other cities that are considering setting them up at the time and since, and in some cases they do, in some cases they fail. And so the FOP actually sees this as a problem of national significance that needs to be stopped. So what, you might ask, is the substance of their opposition to the board? What is the problem that these police unionists have with the board? And here I'm talking about people, as you can see on the left, like John Harrington, who was the president of Lodge 5 from 1964 to 1972. So kind of the back half of the board's existence in Philadelphia. He was also the national president of the FOP over roughly the same period of time. So that's significant in part because of his ability to kind of translate local opposition to the board into a national priority for the FOP across the United States. So what's the objection? I'll show you some materials from one of these pamphlets that the FOP put together. This one's called Police Review Boards, Their History, How They Are Created, A Board in Action. This is issued by the FOP in 1962. And the language that's used in these materials, and remember, these are kind of for internal consumption within police unions, within the FOP, they frame the board as being the product of, it's the creation of what they call pressure groups. And you can sort of see in some of the texts that I've included here that they mention the ACLU by name, but these materials very commonly also mention the NAACP and other kind of liberal or left-wing groups in this period of time who might or might not have supported boards. But certainly they sort of are identifying exactly the sorts of organizations that help bring the board to being in the first place. And they suggest that these boards are kind of the creation of basically communist front groups, right? There's this language of this being the result of a communist conspiracy to undermine the United States from within. And I've highlighted this text at the bottom where they basically say the creation of boards like this creates confusion, unrest, and demoralization of the government and the public which can be identified as communist goals, right? So they sort of saw these boards. I mean, this conspiratorial language that echoes the language of the Red Scare and McCarthyism, which had, you know, kind of wound down not long before, echoes the language of sort of far-right organizations like the John Birch Society that spoke even in this time of kind of a communist conspiracy to undermine the United States from within. They sort of saw this as a way of kind of demoralizing and delegitimizing the police, and taking it, and of sort of communists taking advantage of that to sort of take over the country from within. Now, they don't always use this kind of language in public facing, you know, sort of media appearances and so forth, this more kind of conspiratorial language. But I think, you know, whether you can ask questions about, you know, do they mean this literally? Do they think that there's literally sort of a communist conspiracy to undermine the country from within? Maybe, maybe not. It probably depended on the person to some extent. But one of the functions of this kind of language was to delegitimize these boards as a way of saying the people who support these boards, they don't exist within the civic community of the United States. You ought to see them as outsiders, as threats, as people with whom you don't have a common bond, but somebody who actually is trying to threaten you. And so that they want people to think in those terms about the groups institutionally that help create the board. They want people to sort of think in those terms about the sort of people who are bringing complaints to the board, which tend to be typically sort of working class and disproportionately Black Philadelphians in the case of Philadelphia. And I think that's one of the reasons why they use this kind of language. Another kind of framing that they use, and they use this often for public consumption, is to suggest that boards infringe on the civil rights of police officers themselves. And this is kind of an inversion of and a counter to some of the language that justifies the creation of the boards in the first place. Because, you know, part of it was so that if people felt like their civil rights had been violated by an interaction with a police officer, they could seek some form of redress through a board like this. And this kind of language, which is not limited to the FOP, very common among different police organizations and police unions in this period of time, is that police review boards violate all sorts of civil rights of police officers rather than of the people they interact with. They suggest that it's a due process violation to have a judgment about their interactions be rendered by a board rather than in court, in a civil or criminal proceeding in court. They suggest that this is a violation of the double jeopardy, the protection against double jeopardy in the Bill of Rights, right? That if they worry that that they could be found guilty of a crime in court and then also be found guilty and punished for a violation of department policy by the review board. This third argument you see on the right here, a violation of the right to have his reputation protected against public attack by a government body. It's less clear what sort of constitutional right that's supposed to refer to. It certainly is getting at some idea of not wanting to be like libeled or slandered, but this is put forward as a fundamental civil right. And then suggests that this also violates the right to jury trial and right of appeal. And so again, I think you could go in and substantively evaluate each of these claims and say, well, is this actually invoking a constitutional right? Do these arguments kind of stand up? I think generally they don't, but more important is the idea that of police framing themselves as the actual victims of this relationship, right? As the people whose rights and whose standing in American society is being diminished or harmed in some ways by these boards. Other kinds of arguments that they throw out there are basically that the boards are just bad for good policing, right? That the threat of punishment that might come from the board means that officers are less likely to take action in a difficult situation. This is probably an argument you've heard in contemporary context as well. And so that the board has kind of a demoralizing effect on officers. This is something actually that John Harrington will say on multiple occasions about there's an urban uprising that takes place in Philadelphia in 1964 in response to police brutality that is kind of challenging police racism and segregation and other forms of kind of racialized exclusion and marginalization in the city. And it goes on for a few days and eventually it comes to an end. And Harrington later suggests to the media and and in testimony before legislatures that part of the reason that it lasted as long as it did was because officers feared to take action to bring it to an end, because they didn't want to be sort of found wanting by a civilian review board and punished. There's not really any evidence of that being the case, other than Harrington just saying so in testimony. But this is the kind of framing that's used, right? That actually a board like this is inimical to public safety, inimical to good police work, as officers want to frame their roles. And ultimately, this campaign is extremely successful, especially once Harrington takes over. It predates his leadership of FOP Lodge 5 in Philadelphia, but he's very good at this. And he and the work of the FOP as an organization really kind of helped slowly but surely to bring an end to the PAB in Philadelphia. Part of the reason for that is that the second lawsuit from 1965, there's twists and turns. There's an injunction that's issued and then removed. There's judgments that are appealed and so forth. But as a result of these various steps of the lawsuit, the board is constantly moving in and out of functioning. And so its ability to do anything at all in kind of the second half of the decade is pretty substantially impaired. Another thing is that the FOP kind of gains sympathetic allies in city government that sort of help bring this into being. So on the one hand, if Richardson Dilworth, who created the board through executive order, supported it pretty enthusiastically, his successor, Mayor James Tate, who was the mayor of Philadelphia for about a decade, starting in 1962, he was lukewarm at best on this board. It was not something he was sort of ideologically committed to. And on top of that, he was constantly worried about losing white working class voters in Philadelphia to Republican candidates who were worried that Democratic politicians in the city were not sort of sufficiently enthusiastic proponents of law and order, tough on crime politics. And so he has, as he understands it, this political incentive to not to too enthusiastically support the board. He doesn't nix it immediately, because he also is trying to retain Black voters in Philadelphia politics, and he sees this as an issue that Black voters are going to consider important. But he goes through this political balancing act in his head that makes him a sort of unreliable supporter of the board at best, and increasingly he kind of turns against it. And that's also evident in his appointment as commissioner of Philadelphia, in his appointment as the commissioner in Philadelphia of Frank Rizzo, who from sort of the late 1960s into the early 1970s is the police commissioner and is known for his opposition to the board. So he is not a commissioner who cooperates with the administration of the board to the extent that it functions at all while he is the commissioner, and for his advocacy of really kind of diminishing the accountability of police department to anybody in the public, right? And so ultimately the board actually survives the lawsuits in the end, but at that point it's gone through the ringer so much, and there's sufficiently, Tate basically decides that it's more of a liability than an asset, and even though it survives the lawsuit, he shuts down the board in December of 1969, and that's it. That's the end of the Civilian Review Board in Philadelphia. So we've gone from a period where there's really no mechanism for someone to bring complaints about interactions with police to the city and find some kind of redress for that, to about a little over a decade, sort of, where the board exists on and off, but is kind of brought to an end, and then it's gone after 1969. And you might ask, well, what are some of the other ways that that issues about officers' conduct or complaints about officers' conduct might get resolved? One of them is through police collective bargaining law. So the year before the board is shut down, Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, passes Act 111, which creates for the first time in the state police and firefighter union rights. It gives them the right to sort of form unions and use those to negotiate with cities about the terms and conditions of their employment. This is, I'm showing you a section, just the first section of this law that kind of basically spells that out and gives the basics. And the law is actually not that long. It doesn't explain in too much detail how this is going to work. And then one of the things that explains in even less detail is just this last sort of few lines here, where it says, that police and firemen shall have the right to an adjustment or settlement of their grievances or disputes in accordance with the terms of this act. So this creates a mechanism in the context of collective bargaining and unionization, where if there's going to be some kind of disciplinary action taken against a police officer for any reason, right, potentially in response to a complaint or in response to some kind of interaction that they might have had with the public, this gives them a way to access arbitration, right? It goes to a board that is whose members are appointed partly by the city and partly by the police union, that makes a decision about whether or not there's due process in this action, whether it's consistent with the police union contract and consistent with this law. And this is a mechanism by which officers are often able to challenge or escape various disciplinary actions that sort of take place. And so there's just a little bit of overlap here between the demise of civilian review and the instantiation of police collective bargaining rights, and specifically this kind of arbitration over workplace discipline that sort of comes into being ever since. This is still the law of the land of Pennsylvania, this law. So did the PAB in fact sort of make police meaningfully more accountable to anyone, right? To city government, to the public, to which segment of the public in Philadelphia? I think, there's a case can be made that it did so at least a little bit marginally, right? That there were people were able to had a place where they could bring complaints. They had a venue that was going to try to evaluate those complaints, that would make recommendations, and that some of those recommendations, many of them were in fact sort of followed by the police department. So to some extent, yes, but it's a weak institution, right? It has this advisory role where it doesn't have actually the ability to enforce any of its findings. It has this lack of subpoena powers that makes it difficult to do an investigation in the first place. Its basis in executive order left it kind of vulnerable, right? It meant that a subsequent mayor could decide at any point to just revoke that order and abolish the board. It didn't have to be repealed by city council as a body. It certainly was not established in state law. So that made its existence a little more fragile. And always there was just limited funding and limited staffing for this board. There was always more work coming to it than it could sort of handle in a speedy and efficient way. So that's part of the story. I think given that context, it's also worth asking, why did the FOP treat this as an existential threat? I mean, there are so few recommendations for an officer to be suspended, even none to be fired. What was the threat that the FOP saw in this entity? And I think the way that I like to think of it, it's difficult. It's difficult to not see the sort of huge FOP campaign against this as an overreaction because of how limited the board's powers actually were. But I think what ultimately underlies that is it challenged the principle that police judgments had to trump civilian ones in interactions between police and other people. That police, by the nature of their work and their experience as police officers, they were the ones possessed of the right kind of knowledge and the right kind of judgment to know what to do in a given situation. And that maybe another police officer, maybe a superior officer in the department could second guess that, but that civilians did not have the knowledge or the standing to do so. And that principle was basically at the heart of the Civilian Review Board. And I think that is why the FOP opposed it so intensely. And I think it's also why the issue of accountability is a useful way of thinking about this, because the FOP, and not just the FOP, many members of the police department, they believed that they were accountable to the citizens of Philadelphia, but they believed that they were the ones who had to decide whether they were living up to that role, that other people didn't get to sort of stand in judgment of them in any case. So I think that's one way of understanding what's going on here. All right, so if the PAB was a relatively kind of weak, as I'm characterizing it, institution, were there alternatives, right? If people are interested in increasing the accountability of police officers to Philadelphia residents, if they were looking to do something else, were there other alternatives on the table? And I want to argue that there were some. And in fact, in some cases, they actually tend to crop up as the board is kind of entering into terminal decline. One would be things like grassroots police watch groups. So citizens who are themselves, not the government, but sort of, Philadelphia residents forming organizations that will document instances of police abuse, collect complaints, and try to act on them in some form. And I think one of the most significant is a group that was called Copper. It was actually kind of a federation of many smaller groups, but this Council of Organizations on Philadelphia Police Accountability, that word accountability again, that was founded by Mary Rouse, who you see in the photo on the right there, who was a community and political organizer from Kensington, a neighborhood in kind of near Northeast Philadelphia. Who sort of, as the PAB was in decline, believed that there needed to be some kind of entity that could do this work of collecting complaints and referring them to the government. And so that's exactly what the group does over a period of time from the late 1960s kind of through the early 1970s. And in some cases, Copper refers complaints to federal government that turn into lawsuits about and investigations about civil rights violations. So there's some material response that comes from the work of groups like Copper. But these groups are small, they're not very well resourced, and they're private organizations, right? They're in some meaningful sense, they're trying to fill a gap left by something a public institution is not doing. So that's one alternative. There's people who had even more ambitious ideas about what accountability might mean. One of those was the Germantown Council for Community Control of Police. Germantown is another neighborhood in Philadelphia, kind of near Northwest Philadelphia. And in the 1960s, this was a neighborhood that was a relatively rare, somewhat racially mixed neighborhood. The composition and the geography of the neighborhood was changing, but the GCCCP was a sort of an interracial group of people who were pushing for a kind of robust form of community control of police in their district, right, in the police district to which they belonged. And so they asked for what they called full accountability. And that meant things like being able to review and approve all transfers and promotions of police officers in the 14th district, right? To have representatives from the neighborhood itself be able to review these decisions. Also to have these people be able to have free access to all areas of the district headquarters, right? That there would be no physical space that would be off limits to them at that time. So this is an even more kind of robust sense of, you know, whereas the PAB could only make recommendations, it was appointed by the mayor and so forth. They were wanted as sort of neighborhood-based sort of democratic entity that had actually a lot of coercive authority over decisions that were made about police administration in that area. I think it's worth noting a couple things. One is this language of community control is not limited to this group. This is sort of common language at the time among sort of Black Power organizations, among just sort of new left groups in this period of time that were really believed in kind of sort of small scale local democratic organizations as being a way of kind of replacing larger scale ways of organizing society. So that's just to give some sort of context about where these ideas came from. I also should say that, you know, part of the reason that a proposal like this, unlike, you know, Copper was a functioning organization. The GCCCP, I don't think that was too many C's, never gets an idea like this off the ground because there is not, and they do not build a political constituency to make it happen, and they face a decent amount of repression. So one of the co-founders was Floyd Patton. He was actually a fairly high sort of ranking member of the city water department, and he's let go from that job in June 1969 because the city doesn't want to, quote, bring into government Black militants and others who want to overthrow our government, end quote. So there's a decent amount of kind of repression that's enacted against groups like this as well. You might think another alternative would be the abolition of the police, right? This idea, this sort of political proposal that has become much more widely known in the last sort of several years. And I think the reason that you don't really see this is abolitionist politics as such. The idea that the problem with the police is not one of accountability or sort of imperfection of a perfectible institution, but that police inherently as a sort of a harmful and destructive kind of institution. This idea doesn't or barely exists at this period of time. I'm not saying you couldn't find a group or a person who might propose this, but abolitionist politics as kind of a movement has not yet come into being. And the horizon of most radical politics in this movement is community control. It's the idea that communities kind of taking much more control over the administration of the police is kind of the most kind of transformative thing that people can imagine. Now, you might argue that a police department administered under community control might be so thoroughly transformed that it wouldn't be it wouldn't be the same thing anymore, and therefore that's a form of abolitionist politics. And I can see that argument, but it's not those are not the ideas with which people were sort of thinking and framing what they hope to do in that period of time. All right, so I'm going to leave for the historical story of Philadelphia. I'll leave it there. I'll just wrap up just by saying, where are we now? You know, sort of, this is a story that takes place in the 60s, the 50s, 60s, a little bit into the 70s. What's the state of affairs today? Well, one is that the Civilian Review Board in Philadelphia did not stay dead. And in fact, it is revived in 1993. And even in the period sort of between the sort of demise of the original board and the institution of the second one, what's called the Police Advisory Committee, there's continuously kind of a movement in advocacy to put something back in place. So the movement for a police board doesn't ever entirely go away. The PAC looks a lot like the original PAB. Low budget, not a lot of subpoena power. It could take complaints, but its ability to actually sort of act on them was relatively limited. But that has changed very recently. So in response to sort of a ballot initiative and then some subsequent legislation, all kind of in the wake of the Black Lives Matter sort of protests and uprisings of the summer of 2020, in Philadelphia, basically they've created something they're now calling the Citizens Police Oversight Commission, that seems to have somewhat stronger powers. It can initiate its own investigations on the basis of a complaint or not, can be done proactively. The CPOC is going to have a say in possible charges that might be sort of levied against an officer as a result of, you know, misconduct or brutality. The top administration of the department has to explain certain kinds of decisions in relation to discipline or to court cases to the CPOC. So if they drop charges, they have to explain why to the CPOC. So there's some expansion of the authority of this, and it remains to be seen whether this makes a meaningful difference in terms of accountability or democratic oversight or control of the police department through something like this. There are also efforts right now to amend or repeal Act 111, the Police Collective Bargaining Act, to sort of change the way that disciplinary arbitration works and so forth. I wouldn't say that those are close to succeeding, but there are people in Philadelphia and around the state who are thinking about what would it mean to do that, and would that be a way of increasing accountability of officers to the public. One thing that I will just throw out there about those kinds of politics, there's a question is, you know, will restrictions on police collective bargaining open a political door to a broader rollback of labor rights? They don't have to, but if you suggest that arbitration in cases of discipline within a police department isn't appropriate, police officers aren't the only people who have arbitration. Teachers have arbitration, sanitation workers have arbitration. There's many other categories of employees who have this. And you know, there's a question of how broadly would something like this be applied? Can a case be made that there's something distinctive or unique about police work, maybe the legal right to use violence, that would make it applicable to that limited, you know, the way to limit arbitration in that particular case? Is that sort of thing politically viable? I don't know that there are clear answers to these kinds of things, but I think they're real questions that people kind of have to face as they think about you know, the ways to approach this. But this is just to say that the politics of police accountability are alive and well in Philadelphia today, in many other parts of the country as well. And I hope that there's something useful about the history of the first sort of civilian review board in Philadelphia that helps us think through these questions today. So I will stop sharing my screen and leave it there for now.
Thank you, Dr. Bekemeyer. That was pretty enlightening, especially in light of what's going on today, especially in Southern California. You know, we have many community groups, including Black Lives Matter, who feel like the police have more power than they should have. And I suspect that that's not a, you know, that's not a new idea, because, you know, this has been going on for quite some time. But I was wondering if you could tie in Rizzo as police commissioner, and then Rizzo as mayor a few years later, and his actions at the MOVE event. If you could tell our audience what that was, and then you know, talk about the consequences in terms of the city council, et cetera. I mean, as much as you know.
Sure. No, of course, I can definitely speak to that. So I mean, Frank Rizzo, police officer in the Philadelphia Police Department, as I mentioned, moves pretty quickly up through the ranks. Starts out working in West Philadelphia, but he eventually becomes a captain there before he starts getting promoted to kind of the top brass under James Tate in the 1960s. And he has a reputation for being sort of particularly brutal, and he has a reputation for being racist as well in the city. And so, these are things that make him marketable to someone like James Tate, who's thinking about, how do I choose a police commissioner when he has to do this in the late 1960s, who's going to show to a segment of the city that is worried about the authority of the police being constrained, who are worried that the police aren't able to do enough as a result of things like the Civilian Review Board, are responsive to their concerns. So he appoints Rizzo. And so I think part of what's important about that, the fact that he even just appoints him as the commissioner in the first place, is that all of this is not just sort of inside baseball in the Philadelphia city government. These are all very politically salient issues. The FOP's opposition to the board is part of the reason that the FOP becomes a much better known organization in the first place, locally and nationally, because they're suggesting that their opposition to the board should be linked to a broader set of fears among a predominantly white public in Philadelphia and many other cities who are worried about, on the one hand, an actual material rise in some kinds of crimes, but also kind of linking that to civil rights politics, to Black Power politics, to anti-war protests during the Vietnam War, to all these various things that feel like they're fungible with crime as just threats to the social order in this period of time. So this is a highly politicized issues, and Tate chooses Rizzo for these reasons, to sort of suggest that Rizzo will defend the social order, will protect against crime and so forth. And that also means protecting against, changes to, the inclusion of Black Americans in civil society and in citizenship and in various institutions in Philadelphia that were being sort of pursued, say, by civil rights organizations. And so this is to say that that's part of what helps Rizzo get appointed to that position. And he continues to sort of build this image, right? He's a very kind of media focused commissioner. He loves to chat with journalists and so forth, and present himself a certain way and present the department in a certain way. And so there's a lot of coverage of him. And Tate basically kind of handpicks Rizzo as his successor. Rizzo still has to win a primary and an election, which he does. But Tate kind of taps him to take over. And to the point that this wasn't literally true, but there were people who almost saw Rizzo as kind of a de facto mayor of the city before he was even elected, in the very, very, very tail end of Tate's administration. So that Rizzo is the mayor of Philadelphia from 72 to 80, basically. And one of the things that he's particularly known for is sort of orchestrating the police response to a group called MOVE, which you mentioned in your question. MOVE was a small kind of religious community that kind of seems to have appeared in Philadelphia sometime in the 1970s, mostly but not entirely Black group. And it's difficult to sort of characterize and categorize MOVE. MOVE was kind of in part drew on elements of kind of Black nationalism or Black separatism, drew on elements of kind of like back to nature politics and these kinds of movements that sort of rejected certain kind. They basically it was kind of at the core of it was this kind of like anti-modernism, right? The idea that all the bad things about life in the 1960s stemmed from sort of modern ways of doing things. So they didn't enroll their children in public schools. They rejected certain, sort of like off the rack clothing, maintained a sort of a compound like house where they lived in certain ways where they weren't like killing animals that were considered pests by their neighbors, all sorts of things like this. And you can imagine that this doesn't fit well with most other people's idea of what life in Philadelphia should look like, including the police. And so there's this antagonistic relationship that very quickly develops between the police and MOVE, which generally their neighbors are happy to sort of like bring complaints to the city that MOVE folks are not keeping their house clean, or that they're not that they're being too loud. You know, sometimes like messages are being yelled from megaphones in the MOVE household, in the MOVE compound, and things like this. And ultimately, one of these interactions between in this kind of ratcheting effect between police and MOVE ends with the police shooting and killing a MOVE member. And this kind of eventually kind of turns into a police siege of the MOVE compound. It's the siege kind of comes first, but then one of the MOVE members is shot during this siege. So it's this escalating series of events where the police are basically besieging the MOVE compound. And while most Philadelphians sort of at best consider MOVE a nuisance, in this context they kind of become a focal point for people who are opposing police brutality, because they see the police response to MOVE. It's so intense, right? And it involves the death of a MOVE member, and you know, this is, you know, with sort of authorization from the top, right, all the way up to Rizzo, and so the police treatment of MOVE kind of becomes a lens through which people think about policing in Philadelphia and police brutality and things like this. That particular incident is kind of wound down eventually, but there's this kind of vendetta that the police have against MOVE that kind of several years later in the mid-1980s, through another escalating series of events, turns into the police bombing the MOVE compound, a different building in West Philadelphia, killing many people, injuring others, basically burning a whole city block in West Philadelphia, not only the MOVE compound, but also you know, just the neighbors, right? Often people who are actually bringing complaints about MOVE to the city, their houses just all get sort of burnt down. And it's just one of these moments of truly kind of exceptional and spectacular violence that emerges out of the daily interactions, ultimately, of police and the politics of people like Rizzo, who don't want to set an upper limit on the amount of violence that is justifiable on the part of police. And I just want to note that Heather Ann Thompson, a historian at the University of Michigan, is currently writing a book specifically about the MOVE bombing and its origins and so forth. I don't think there's a release date or anything for that yet, but that's something to keep an eye out for if this is a topic that anyone's interested in.
Yeah, I thought I saw that happen in real time, you know, because the cameras were there, and Rizzo made such an impression because he was boasting about killing these children. I think there were 11 or 12 people killed, something like 65 homes destroyed, because these were row homes, and we're not accustomed to that in California, although I think it's very popular back east. But it's just a group of row homes, and, you know, 65 families were out of a home at the time. And even then, when I was not as critical of law enforcement and criminal justice, I saw it as an outrage. I mean, just an absolute outrage that he would almost be gleeful over the deaths of these folks. And there were actually some accusations that as people were fleeing the burning buildings, that police officers, 500 of whom showed up, and they were shooting at them like, you know, like so many ducks in a pond or something. And I've always seen him as kind of a villain in this whole police debate, because he was just so obviously racist and gleeful about what was going on. So thank you for talking about that. We do have a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Do you have a little bit more time so that we can? Great. So first is Honorable Villanueva. Do other countries have police misconduct similar to the United States, not including events of protest suppression? Good question.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, absolutely. I will qualify my answer by saying that I I know really the case I know is the case of how policing works in the United States, and I'm not an expert in how it works in other countries, but I know enough to know that police the institution that we sort of recognize them for exist sort of all around the world, and this question of how are, what's the proper administration of police, to whom should police be accountable, what is that accountability going to look like? These questions are universal. How that plays out, what that looks like, what kind of measures people take in any given case really kind of depends certainly on the country. But I'll note on the one hand that police unions are also not unique to the United States. Police unions exist in other countries as well. And the other thing is that one of the things that the United States has done in the last but better part of a century has tried to export the model of American policing to other countries by sending police administrators and trainers to sort of train, police administrators in other parts of the world, by funding police, law enforcement organizations in other parts of the world. There's a couple of very good books on exactly this topic by, I'll just put the names. I don't know if I can put the names in the chat.
Sure.
I think I can.
Yeah.
Stuart Schrader and Nicole Siegel have each written books about exactly this kind of thing. And so one way to think about it, if you're aware of a situation of police abuse or police brutality in another country, and you see the politics of it playing out in similar ways, there's a number of possible explanations why, but one of the reasons might be that the United States has had a role in actually shaping the way that policing works in countries around the world.
Yeah, I would also note that in the former colonial powers like France and Germany, and to a certain extent, maybe Italy, where you have a lot of immigration from the former colonies, you find a lot of complaints, complaints against police brutality. You don't see it in Iceland. You don't see it in Greenland or Finland or Sweden. You see it in those former colonies, or not the former colonies, but the former colonial powers, like England, France, and Germany, and so forth. So I think it's a question that is worth pursuing, and something that we may even look at in this space. Another question, this is the same type of language, not sure it's a question, but a comment. This is the same type of language in why the officers don't need to do de-escalation training or racial sensitivity training. Comment?
Totally. I mean, it's one of the things that's striking to me about doing this research is seeing how much of the language with which people talked and debated about politics of policing in the 1960s is so similar to the language today. And that's partly because that's where some of this language originates or becomes popularized. And it's partly because the underlying issues are, if not identical, remain very, very similar. And there's this idea in some cases that a part of what it means to be a police professional, right? A person who sort of is trained and experienced and knows sort of the work of policing, means that there's a special kind of professional knowledge that they have only by virtue of doing it, and that's the thing that prevents anybody else from having a more valuable judgment about the nature of their work. And to challenge that actually raises a much broader question about the relative roles of like democracy and expertise in any institution in society. But the stakes are obviously some of the highest when it comes to questions of police, because police have, the right legally to use violence, and in practice, pretty much unlimited violence. And so that's the situation where those questions, I think, are most urgent.
Right. Can we assume, though, that because there is not an emphasis on de-escalation in police training, that maybe a big leap here, but that police departments don't really want to de-escalate? I mean, isn't that sort of a logical conclusion?
Yeah, I think, yes, it is. In some cases, that's the case, where there's actually specifically a desire not to de-escalate.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be true with some officers and with some departments. And I think the even more general thing is that when a given officer or when a given person in the chain of command doesn't want to de-escalate, right, escalates the situation even. The departments are committed to protecting that, right, to sort of saying that ultimately that's part of the legitimate discretion of a police officer. So sometimes it's an institutional priority to not de-escalate, and sometimes it's an institutional priority to just protect the choice not to de-escalate. And I hope that's not too fine a distinction. I think that matters, because it's about carving out a really broad sphere of discretion for officers, however they kind of choose to exercise it.
Right. Okay. Getting on to the third question from Honorable, another from Honorable Villanueva. Would you consider lobbying as bribing politicians, even though it is legal? So this is kind of a broader question, obviously, than what we're talking about today. But any thoughts on that particular?
I think that lobbying is a big and capacious category, and so in some cases it's going to look a lot like bribing, and in some cases, to my judgment, it's going to look like a legitimate democratic activity, democratic society, the kind of thing that any group of people could do to communicate with elected representatives. So that's a pretty generic answer, but that is.
But I'm pretty certain that police organizations, especially on the national level, have lobbyists in Washington.
Absolutely, and one of the
Sacramento and other capitals.
Absolutely, and one of the reasons that that's the case is, especially for entities that would become police unions, is that before they were legally recognized as unions, because police don't really find collective bargaining rights most of the time, legally speaking, like statutorily speaking, until the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Before that, to achieve certain changes in policy, they couldn't do it through collective bargaining. They had to do it by lobbying. Like, that was the vehicle through which they actually brought about changes. And so from a very early sort of date in the 20th century, the FOP and other police groups sort of develop pretty robust, well-funded, and savvy kind of lobbying operations, where they're very present in in state capitals and in sort of city halls, national politics too, but especially in state and local politics, and that's been true for a century.
Yeah. So what do you see as the fundamental difference, let's say, between a police union or corrections officers union, which is one of the most powerful in this state,
right,
versus, let's say, a plumbers union or pipe fitters union, teachers union? What are the differences, do you think?
Well, in terms of what they're actually doing when it comes to lobbying or making campaign contributions and so forth, there actually is not much of a difference, right? That's the same kind of activity, the same way of making a contribution or lobbying a representative as like a plumbers union can also do. I think that some of the differences lie in the way that they kind of frame the significance of what they're doing, because always the question of policing for say a police union ties back to ideas of crime and safety, right? And it's sort of to suggest that if police don't have enough money, enough discretion, enough support, there will be more harm and less safety in society. So they make the stakes sort of seem as high as possible, and that kind of framing has weight. That's part of the reason why they were successful in the story that I'm talking about in the 60s. It's part of the reason why they're such politically effective organizations today, is because of that framing around crime and safety. So that's part of it. Sure. And sometimes it's just to do with other, I guess the nature of that point too is that police strikes are a relatively rare thing. They do happen. And so there's also like a threat that police can make that a plumber can't make by saying, if I withdraw my labor, what I'm telling you is the world is about to get a lot more dangerous. And that's going to sort of redound negatively on you. And whether or not that's true, a plumber has a hard time making that threat. And that's, I think, another kind of relevant difference there.
Hopefully you have room for one more question or time for one more question, but I need to throw this over to my colleague, Jeremy Murphy. If you have any comments or questions, Jeremy? I do see the hand finally.
I wanted to follow up on your point and a little bit on Honorable, and this might connect to our last question from Kalia, which is about the comparison. And this is a little bit similar to Kalia's question. But I'll read Kalia's question and then maybe bundle in one of mine quick. But Kalia says, I just can't understand the argument that PAB infringed on police civil rights? Wasn't it akin to an HR or performance review for the police? Or was that normal back then? So that's a little bit like Mary's question about different unions and different organizations. And I'm also interested in the distinctiveness of, you mentioned McCarthy, McCarthyism, and the distinctiveness of the sort of strange bedfellows of McCarthy era politics in terms of populism, left-wing organizing, and racism within that world, which is going to be very different, I think, from different contexts, and so very distinctive. The ways in which left-wing or extremely progressive, even radical politics can sometimes be braided in with a kind of racism, and whether or not that accounts for any of the police union racism. Their sort of rhetoric of worker rights, worker protections, that comes up when it's convenient, but obviously they're effectively strike breakers when they want to be, right? Anyway, that's a word salad, but basically, is there something distinctive about the American context that makes a police union a very peculiar animal?
Distinctive about the American context, maybe, because but what's distinctive about the American context, most of all, I think, is that the politics of this are very local, right? That it's locally elected governments that are, setting up police departments, appointing police commissioners, running police departments. That if somebody wants to change those things, it's on the terrain of local politics, city politics, county politics, something like that tends to happen. So I think that's the most distinctively American thing about this. It's harder for me to say whether this particular blend of like mixing labor politics with sort of racism is distinctively American. My guess is it's not, but I'm just speculating when I say that. But I think it's also sort of, I think sometimes when we're talking about this issue, there's a question of like how cynical are police or police officers or police unionists being when they talk about these kinds of things? Is this just kind of a cynical exploitation of the language of labor or labor law, collective bargaining system that just happens to be useful for minimizing oversight of police officers or something like that? And I don't think that it is. We could have a conversation about are police workers or not, are police unions or not. I think that depends a lot on what we mean by workers and unions, and those words are like loaded with a lot of associations for people that I think are worth making explicit. But what I do think is that policing is a kind of work. I think I feel confident saying that, and it's a kind of work that involves basically making a judgment between is a given person the police officer interacts with a law-abiding citizen or a criminal, right? And the former category has legal standing and access to sort of the full suite of rights that a citizen is supposed to have access to. And by being classified as a criminal on the view of police, those things are compromised. You're being placed at least partly outside of that sort of civic community. And so I think the reason that police officers sort of frame a resistance to civilian review boards that are being used by Black Philadelphians to counter police racism as a violation of their civil rights. I think there's a conflation of civil rights and other kinds of things going on here. I don't disagree with Kalia's question about the fact that a constitutional right against double jeopardy doesn't necessarily protect you from a disciplinary action at work. I think that's a deliberate conflation on the part of police officers. But I do think that they genuinely see it as an impairment of the work that they do. They think it's their job to make those kinds of judgments. And in the specific society that we live in, the United States, one that is which access to citizenship is so heavily racialized, that is part of the work of policing. It is actually about reinforcing those kinds of racial boundaries and exclusions. And I think that's where that comes from. And I do think it's earnest and sincere on the part of most of the people who use that kind of language.
Can I jump in?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
Just a quick follow-up with something, Aaron, that might, and I'm not a historian of America, so you guys both can set me straight on this, but a big distinction maybe between this historical moment that you're looking at and the current moment is the way in which suburbanization, white flight made so much of the police force not being drawn from that working neighborhood, but being drawn from a different neighborhood, so that there's a class distinction today, maybe not a strict class distinction necessarily, but I think a geographical distinction that might be connected to a class distinction that makes some of that workers' rights thing ring a little more hollow. You know, everybody's oppressed. You know, the police are talking about how they're oppressed and hamstrung, of course, which is, of course, absurd. But the sort of white and increasingly middle class, or at least upper working class police officers who are commuting into cities in the 21st century is maybe different from the class rhetoric of the 50s and 60s, when that was not really quite happening yet. Is that an important, relevant distinction to the kind of class language?
Yeah, I think that the significance of whether or not the officers were sort of coming from the cities or the neighborhoods that they policed, I mean, this is something that people have turned to as kind of an explanatory factor here in terms of how responsive or accountable are police to, you know, their communities. And I think that you know, Philadelphia still has a residency requirement for police officers in the city, and that does not seem to have stopped you know, police abuse and police brutality from being a problem in the city. So that, you know, that's one thing. But I do think what you're speaking to, I mean, when police unionists didn't have collective bargaining rights, when they were making the case for this, they made the case for police union rights along a lot of lines, and some of the most politically salient were these ones about discipline and the role of the relationship of the police to the public. But they also said things like police pay is lagging, you know, benefits are lagging, and in some cases it was true, right? This, you know, public sector unions in general were not sort of legally recognized in a lot of places, and you know, raises and benefits and so forth were kind of skyrocketing in certain unionized parts of the private sector in a way that they weren't in the public sector in general, and for policing in particular. So if you, it would be difficult to do this because the data is hard to find, but if you went and you collected the data on pay and benefits and so forth for a given city, say Philadelphia in 1950 for the police relative to the median for the private sector or something, and you did the same thing for Philadelphia now, I think you would see a lot of those changes that you identified, that today there's much better access to good pay and benefits and overtime and so forth that legitimately were not there for police officers at the beginning of this story.
And just very quickly related to Jeremy's question about people coming in your research, have you had a sense in, you know, just one little snippet of either police as a group or individual officers understanding who they work for? In other words, you know, they are not independent entities. They have to respond to certainly the mayor, the city council, but also the people in the community. Do you get a sense that they understand that at all?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And so a good example of this actually would be, there's another kind of rank and file organization in the Philadelphia Police Department in the same period of time, and that's the Black Officers Association there. It's called the Guardian Civic League. And unlike the police union, which really kind of lined up heavily on the side of sort of law and order politics, the Black Officers Association actually was very much aligned with civil rights politics in the city at the time, and supported things like the Civilian Review Board and other kinds of efforts to combat police brutality and discrimination and abuse and so forth, sometimes to the extent that there's personnel overlap. So there was an officer named Alfonso Deal, who is just, if you can find anything about him Googling or looking through newspapers, I encourage you to. Just a very interesting figure who was a Black police officer, the head for a period of time in the 60s and 70s of the Guardian Civic League, the head of his chapter of the NAACP, and a deacon in his church. And so he kind of sits at the intersection of these spaces that were very much tied to the civil rights movement at the time, and also within the police department. And so this is a way of kind of complicating the story to say that it's not simply by virtue of being a police officer that you end up taking the kinds of positions that FOP leaders did. And you know, this is another one of the alternatives, looking at the GCL and people like Alfonso Deal.
But the vast majority of officers, what, they reject the idea that they have to answer to ordinary people? Or
I think the way that they see it is they believe that they are in service to the public, but their idea of the public does not include civil libertarians, Black
people in
like this
MOVE.
kind of thing. Yeah, people in MOVE,
Yeah.
absolutely not the people in MOVE, right? The people in MOVE represent the furthest thing from membership
Yes.
in the public, in the eyes
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the police.
Yeah.
And so they have a particular idea of the public, and they believe that the people who should enforce that relationship are they themselves, not any
Right.
civilians.
Right. And one other thing, and then we'll certainly let you go, that I have found, especially during that time, you know, the 70s, the 80s, you have former Vietnam veterans who are I don't want to use the term infiltrating, but they are coming back and they are wanting jobs, and so they get on police departments. And I suspect the same thing is true of Afghanistan and Iraq. And so I don't know if this is beyond the scope of what you're doing, but do you feel that like that has any sort of influence on departments as well as officers?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. From my own research, I'm at pains to sort of say anything terribly specific about that, but I know that there are, for folks like that, say veterans from military service who moved into work in policing, and also for people not of that background necessarily, but who shared similar ideas, the military was the way to fight enemies abroad, and the police was the way to fight enemies at home. And that's part of why this language of anti-communism is so present for these police unionists and opposing the police advisory board in Philadelphia, because they saw themselves as fighting the home front of the Cold War. And so I think there are people who come back from military service in Vietnam and so forth. They come home and they say, well, I'm going to continue to fight at home. And for some of those people, what that means is joining the police department and fighting threats to American society as they understand them, which takes the form of Black Power activists, anti-war protesters, poor people, Black people, whatever, particular group is salient to them.
Okay. Well, we want to thank the 38 or so folks who have hung in with us this entire time, because it was certainly a compelling conversation. And we're going to keep you on our list, Dr. Bekemeyer. We're going to keep you on our list, and we will be re-inviting you, I'm sure. So hang in there.
Thank you.
And thank you again. Thank you so much for enlightening our campus and our community today.
Thanks for having me back. I was really glad to join you again.
You bet. You bet. We'll see you next time.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Aaron.
Bye.